At 0417 hours on November 17, 1942, Sergeant Dmitri the welder Kozlov wasn't fighting German infantry. He was fighting ice, exhaustion, and physics itself. Positioned about 600 meters from the infamous Stalingrad tractor factory, a hellscape of twisted iron and filthy snow, Kozlov was crouched beneath the sloping belly of a T-34. 76th, his body trembling so violently that his shivers competed with the vibrations of German mortar explosions tearing through the frigid air. The officially recorded temperature at the 62nd Army headquarters was 28 degrees Celsius, but the wind blowing off the Volga pushed the wind chill into something indescribable, something that froze hydraulic oil and turned steel into brittle glass. Kozlov's mission was simple. If anything under constant enemy fire can be called simple, rescue Captain Volkov's command tank, a vital pillar in the east sector of Red Stalingrad. But the problem was anything but trivial. At 0330 hours, a 75mm Wehrmacht Pak-40 shell hadn't penetrated the T-34's frontal armor, but a lateral impact near an anti-tank mine, unearthed by the blast, had been enough to shatter the engine's main support, the mounting cradle, and break the transmission coupling sleeve linking the 500-horsepower V2 engine to the gearbox. The engine still ran, but it was misaligned and spinning freely, completely divorced from the tracks. The T-34, once a spearhead of the Soviet offensive, was now a motionless metallic sarcophagus, just 350 meters from German sniper positions. Kozlov wasn't an ordinary mechanic, and the 317th Repair Engineering Battalion, to which he belonged, was, to use the High Command's official term, a necessary aberration, while the Red Army's repair manual demanded that a T-34 with such structural damage be towed to a repair yard behind the Volga. The 317th, nicknamed by its comrades the Stalingrad MacGyvers, or, less affectionately, the junkyard thieves, operated under a different doctrine. If it can be fixed in 4 hours with scrap found on the battlefield, it can't be fixed at all. The unit had been formed, paradoxically, from elements the Army deemed undesirables: mechanics with records of insubordination, soldiers caught borrowing hearts from civilian depots, and engineers who considered official diagrams mere suggestions. While Soviet bureaucracy saw these men as discipline headaches, Colonel Maximov, who oversaw them, saw a brutal and practical advantage. Maximov knew that at Stalingrad, supplies didn't arrive. The only supply store was the battlefield itself. A mechanic by the book waits for the spare part, Maximov would growl. A MacGyver makes the spare part. Sergeant Kozlov was the pinnacle of that philosophy. A former shipyard welder from Leningrad, he had large, scarred hands that could feel the tension in metal. His record was marred: a fight with an officer over steel quality, and a documented case of building an improvised weapon from leftover pipe. But here, in the hell of Stalingrad, his transgressions became virtues. He needed a new transmission coupling sleeve. He had only a torch, a piece of twisted railroad rail found in a collapsed bunker, and the insane determination not to leave a T-34 to German capture. At 0432 hours, Sergeant Kozlov crawled out from beneath the tank. Captain Volkov, a 40-year-old man with steel eyes and an ice beard, watched him from the open hatch. "So, Sergeant?" Volkov asked, his voice hoarse over static and cold. "How long until we're just an oil stain in the frozen ground?" Kozlov inhaled deeply. The air was so dry and cold, it seemed to burn his lungs. He didn't have the right tools. He didn't have proper alloy metal. He had warped rail, a pair of pliers, and the primitive electric welding rig they cobbled together from 2 captured Jeep generators. "Captain," Kozlov replied, thrusting his head back into the oily darkness of the engine compartment, 30 minutes. "If the barrage gives us 30 minutes, we'll MacGyver something that'll keep this thing running for 10 kilometers. Enough to get out of this hole." The tactical decision was clear. Attempt an almost impossible field repair under fire, risking the lives of Kozlov's 4-man crew. and Volkovs, or abandon the T-34, losing a crucial asset and letting the Germans capture it for analysis. There was no halfway option. Kozlov chose the challenge. He dropped to the side of the tank. He needed heat, lots of it, and to get it, he would have to weld. Welding in Stalingrad in the pre-dawn darkness was like announcing your location to the enemy, like a beacon in a storm. At 0445 hours, the first burst of bluish-green light erupted from beneath the T-34, cutting through the absolute darkness of the Russian winter. The glow was an open invitation to every sniper and artillery piece in the sector. Sergeant Kozlov, the welder, had just lit his torch, beginning to forge a critical piece out of scrap while death watched from 300 meters away. Survival engineering in its most desperate form had just begun. The sharp smell of ozone and burning metal competed with the stench of gunpowder and frozen diesel. At 0447 hours, just 2 minutes after Sergeant Kozlov ignited his improvised welding arc, Stalingrad's private hell reacted. The intense glow leaking from beneath the T-34's side skirts was a blatant violation of every rule of night camouflage. Across the ruins of Warehouse No. 7, the enemy didn't need binoculars to spot the signal. They needed only a target. The response came fast, a sharp, snapping shoot from a 20mm Flak 38 automatic cannon. A weapon the Germans frequently repurposed for low-altitude anti-infantry fire. High explosive rounds slammed into the snow and steel around the T-34 with the deafening sound of gravel hurled against a metal drum. Private Pavel, Kozlov's assistant, lying flat in the snow while holding the flashlight and grounding cable for the weld, shouted a muffled warning. "They see us, Dmitri. For God's sake, get down." Kozlov was less than 14 inches from a transmission coupling sleeve. He was literally inventing from nothing. The twisted railroad rail scavenged from the ruins was low-grade carbon steel, far from ideal, but it was the only thick metal available. He had cut it into a 12-inch segment, roughly hammering it into a crude cylinder before beginning the fusion work. He needed a joint precise enough to withstand the massive torque of a V2 engine. He was attempting it with a torch that barely reached optimal temperature under enemy fire in ambient conditions cold enough to cause freshly welded steel to cool too fast, creating internal stresses that could shatter the joint the moment the tank accelerated. 30 minutes, Pavel," Kozlov shouted, his voice muffled behind an improvised welding mask made from a steel plate fitted with darkened glass. "The time it takes to tow this thing is the time it takes a panzer grenadier to flank us. We need that sleeve solid." Inside the T-34, Captain Volkov and his crew began firing back desperately. The 76mm gun barked at suspected German positions along the front line, not to destroy them, but to suppress the 20mm fire and buy Kozlov precious seconds. Each shot rocked the tank's hull, threatening to crack the fragile work Kozlov was forcing into existence. The T-34 repair manual demanded tolerances of 0.05 millimeters for this coupling sleeve to ensure proper fit and power transfer. Kozlov was working with tolerances best described as looks right, and if it fits, maybe it'll hold. The real problem wasn't T-welding the scrap rail. It was creating the internal splines that would lock onto the output shaft and transmit torque. With proper tools, this required a lathe and a precision mandrel. Kozlov had a lock-in pliers, a 5-kilogram hammer, and the sharpened tip of a chisel he had re-ground himself. His improvised engineering solution was both brutal and elegant. He abandoned the idea of perfect splines altogether. Instead, he chose to weld the rail steel sleeve directly onto what remained of the shaft, transforming the damaged coupling into a single forged, re-welded unit. It violated every rule of metallurgy. Direct welding on a high-stress transmission shaft practically guaranteed structural failure, but it was the only solution that could be executed in under an hour. "Pavel, the extra gasoline tank we pulled off the Jeep," Kozlov ordered. He needed to preheat the area far beyond what the welding arc alone could provide, to reduce thermal shock and prevent immediate cracking. Using an empty oil can and gasoline as a crude localized heater, Kozlov and Pavel tried to raise the temperature of the steel surrounding the engine. The result was a thick cloud of black, oily smoke that, ironically, helped mask the welding glow for a few critical moments. At 05:05 hours, enemy fire escalated. Now 81mm mortar rounds were landing every 30 seconds. A glowing fragment ricocheted off the side armor, passing inches from Pavel's head. Kozlov was halfway through fusing the railroad rail to the broken transmission shaft. The steel glowed cherry red. He was forced into a real-time decision dictated by physics and incoming fire. The weld was solidifying, but the rail steel was far softer than the original high alloy shaft. If he tried to shape it precisely under the hammer, he risked cracking the fresh weld. If he left it too rough, the sleeve could strike the engine casing once the tank moved. There was no time to calculate. Over the radio, Captain Volkov's voice broke through the noise. "Sergeant, infantry movement. They're closing in to inspect the gift." The 30-minute deadline was evaporating. Kozlov dropped the torch, grabbed the 5-kilogram hammer, and delivered 3 short, precise blows to the still hot metal. Not to shape it, but to test the weld under shock. The steel groaned, but it held. "Move, Pavel. We reconnect the transmission, now." At 0510 hours, German infantry was less than 100 meters away, crawling silently through the snow. Assuming the silence of the tank meant abandonment. The T-34 had no more than 5 minutes to roar back to life, or the price of the repair would be the lives of every man inside the perimeter. Kozlov had just created a transmission component from a railroad rail. Now came the final test. Could it move 26 tons of steel? 512 hours? The smell of evaporating gasoline and overheated metal hung over the snow. German infantry, seasoned grenadieri trained in urban combat, advanced in dispersed formation, confident that the T-34 was disabled and abandoned. They expected a cold carcass, maybe frozen bodies. They did not expect a welder defying Soviet automotive engineering in the middle of a snowstorm. Kozlov, with Pavel at his side, worked frantically to reconnect the transmission to the engine cradle, using the last intact bolts they could scavenge from the tank's interior floor and reinforcing the mount with pieces of rebar ripped from the collapsed concrete skeleton of the tractor factory. Captain Volkov, tense at the commander's hatch, spotted movement. "Kozlov. 3 figures, less than 70 meters, right flank. If we don't move now, they'll come in with hand grenades." The tension was physical. The transmission shaft was now mated to the improvised railroad rail sleeve, and that sleeve was brutally welded onto the engine's output shaft. It was a metallic monstrosity, completely outside specifications, but it was seated. "Done. Get up, Sergeant," Pavel shouted, dragging Kozlov out from under the tank. Kozlov crawled into the engine compartment and gave his creation one last critical look. The weld was ugly, uneven, but deep. He prayed the low-grade rail steel wouldn't shear under torque. He slapped the engine casing, part respect, part plea. Now came ignition. Diesel engines at 28 degrees Celsius are notoriously difficult to start, even with winter oils. The T-34 required a precise sequence, often relying on its pneumatic compressed air starter to crank the massive engine. 514 hours. The tank driver, Lieutenant Boris, took a breath and engaged first gear. "Excuse us, comrades," he muttered, hitting the starter. A 5.2 diesel groaned. Thick white smoke erupted from the exhausts. The engine coughed, hesitated, then, with a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the frozen foundations of the earth itself, it caught. But running wasn't enough. When Boris released the clutch, the tank shuddered violently. "Throttle, Boris. Now." Volkov barked. Kozlov's improvised coupling sleeve was slammed with brutal shock load. Instead of smooth power transfer, there was a dry, horrifying metallic crack, a sound that froze every man inside the fighting compartment. For a fraction of a second, Kozlov was certain the rail had snapped. It hadn't. The T-34 moved. It lurched forward, tracks slipping on frozen snow. A tank that had been dead for 2 hours, under artillery fire, and a blizzard, was alive again. 515 hours. The German grenadieri, now just 50 meters away, stopped in absolute shock. They had expected a skeleton. Instead, a 26-ton steel beast surged toward them. Volkov didn't hesitate. Main gun fire, coaxial MG sweep the right flank. Powered by Kozlov's scrap metal engineering, the T-34 surged forward. Driver Boris compensated desperately for the 3-degree misalignment in the freshly welded transmission. The tank no longer moved smoothly. Grinding and scraping echoed from the engine bay, but it held 15 kilometers per hour. The tank's resurrection shattered German morale and tactical cohesion in the sector. The 20 millimeters fire ceased. The infantry advance dissolved into panic. The Germans had not planned for resurrection. 518 hours. The T-34 smashed through German patrol lines and crushed an MG-34 position under its tracks. Captain Volkov used the resurrected 26-ton pillar of steel not just to escape, but to punch a corridor through the battlefield. Inside the engine compartment, Kozlov could not relax. He knew the welded railroad rail was holding, but for how long? The impossible repair had saved the crew, but the escape was not finished. They still needed 4 kilometers of continuous movement to reach the 62nd Army's safety zone, and the grinding noise from the engine bay grew louder with every meter. The impossible fix was surviving, but the bill was coming due. 523 hours. The T-34 roared down Komsomolskaya Avenue, a desolate stretch of ice-covered asphalt littered with rubble leading toward the Soviet-controlled area near the Volga. The tank advanced like a wounded animal. The high-pitched grinding noise coming from the transmission was a booming testament to Kozlov's scrap metal hack. Inside the fighting compartment, the crew was exhausted but euphoric. They had escaped encirclement by German infantry, but now faced a more subtle enemy, imminent structural failure. Captain Volkov, despite the adrenaline, kept his cool. He knew that every revolution of the newly welded transmission shaft was testing the limits of emergency metallurgy. Boris, keep a constant speed. If the engine fails now, we're dead in the middle of the street, he ordered. Kozlov, now back at his post as a lateral gunner, his field mechanic duties temporarily suspended, listened to the sound of the coupling sleeve as if it were his own irregular heartbeat. He knew the softer rail steel was wearing rapidly due to misalignment and stress. Friction generated heat, and heat inside an engine bay full of oil and diesel, under fire, was a ticking time bomb. They had covered 1,500 meters, but the path ahead was blocked. At the intersection with Pavshik-Bortsov Street, an overturned Soviet ammo truck lay across the road, and a small German reconnaissance unit had taken position around it, using the wreckage as cover for a light Pak 36-37 millimeters gun, a laughably small door hammer against T-34 armor, but dangerous enough to disable the tracks. Targets at the crossing, Pak 36, Volkov shouted. Driver Boris faced a clear tactical dilemma, safe but slow option. Halt, use the 76 millimeters to clear the crossroads, and advance cautiously. Risk, give the engine time to fail while stationary, or allow German artillery to realign. Brutal and fast option, full throttle. Use momentum to blast through the intersection before the 37 millimeters gun could get an accurate shot. Risk, a maximum torque of acceleration could finally shatter the improvised coupling sleeve. Volkov didn't hesitate. Boris, full power. We ram the pack. Boris floored the accelerator like a man fighting for life. The 5-2 engine screamed. Dark smoke from unburnt diesel shrouded the area. Kozlov, in the fighting compartment, closed his eyes. The grinding sound transformed into a shriek of metal being torn loose. The tank surged from 15 kilometers per hour to 30 kilometers per hour in seconds. The improvised coupling sleeve, made of railroad rail and emergency welds, was now under the full load of 500 horsepower. It did not break, but under stress, the metal began to heat dangerously. The Pak-36 fired twice. The 37mm rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the T-34's frontal armor. Then the T-34 reached the German position. The impact was deafening. The Pak-36 was crushed beneath the tracks. 538 hours. They were free of immediate threat, but the cost of acceleration was evident. The smell of overheated and burning metal filled the fighting compartment. "Kozlov, what's that smell?" Volkov asked. Kozlov checked the temperature gauge, but it was unreliable. He didn't need it. "Captain," Kozlov said, his voice tense, "the improvised coupling sleeve is overheating. The misalignment and soft metal are generating heat fast. If we don't stop or slow down, it could fail completely. We need a new repair." They still had 2,500 meters to go to the improvised repair on the Volga. Stopping was not an option. The Germans were regrouping. Kozlov realized the terrible paradox. He had resurrected the tank, but his own solution was killing it slowly. "Boris," Kozlov said, gathering himself, "can you hold 10 kilometers per hour? Stay in the highest gear you can. I have to make another weld on the move." The idea was insane. Repairing a critical engine component in a battlefield was one thing. Doing it while the tank rolled over ice and debris with a primitive weld was pure madness. But it was their only way to cover the last 2,500 meters. The survival engineer of Stalingrad was about to chart unknown territory, risking that a single spark could ignite diesel vapors, or worse, that the tank's motion could weld the engine to itself. 545 hours. The T-34 limped toward the Volga, less than 1,000 meters from the relative safety of Soviet lines. The engine compartment was unbearably hot, and smoke from the overheating railroad rail coupling sleeve now leaked visibly through the rear hatch. Kozlov was back inside the engine bay, hunched over the V2 diesel as the tank jolted violently across frozen craters and the wrecks of destroyed panzers. He had reassembled the torch, but this time, the weld wasn't to fuse parts, but to reinforce. He was adding a secondary ring of scrap metal, a segment of armor plate originally designed to protect the radiators, around the rail sleeve. His hope was to create a kind of metal straitjacket to prevent the part from expanding or failing under heat and stress. Welding a moving object is near impossible improvisation. The constant jolts forced Kozlov to rely on pure instinct, anticipating the next impact. He was inches from moving components, where a single wrong motion could jam his arm or the torch into the transmission. German fire was sporadic, but the real threat was now internal. 551 hours, 400 meters to go. The final weld was nearly complete. The reinforcing ring glowed blood red, fusing with the original rail sleeve. Kozlov pulled away the torch, overcome by exhaustion, the sweat freezing instantly along the edges of his mask. "Done. That's all I can do," he shouted. Minutes later, at 0555 hours, the T-34 crossed the demarcation line. Captain Volkov's command tank, powered by the most improbable piece of engineering in the Battle of Stalingrad, had made it. Kozlov crawled out of the engine compartment. The stench of scorched metal was overwhelming, but the tank was still in one piece. The repair depot mechanics stared in disbelief at the engine bay. They saw the aberration. A transmission shaft reinforced with a chunk of railroad rail, held together by a chaotic weld. According to the principles of engineering, it shouldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. It had lasted 43, through nearly 4 kilometers of active combat, allowing 5 men to escape and keeping a T-34 in the fight. The improvised sleeve, of course, was replaced later that day with a proper factory-built component. But for years after the war, the rail fix of Stalingrad became a whispered legend among Soviet field engineers. Sergeant Dmitri Kozlov and the Stalingrad hacks had proven that in a war of scarce resources and extreme survival, creativity and desperation were worth more than any manual. They didn't just fix a tank. They challenged physics to hold the line. The cost was high, but the lesson was clear. Survival engineering on the Eastern Front was more than skill. It was a test of unbreakable will. If this story of Sergeant Kozlov and his battlefield improvisation in Stalingrad moved you, don't click away. Hit like. Hit subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you re-watching from and whether anyone in your family served in World War II. You're part of the reason these men are not erased from history. Sergeant Kozlov and the 317th Field Repair Battalion did their duty in 1942. Ours is to remember. Like, comment, and share to keep their story alive. Never forget.